Good afternoon or evening, depending where you are. My name is David Swanson. I'm campaign coordinator at RootsAction Education Fund. This is our very first monthly book club. You can check out all the future ones and go ahead and read the books by visiting teachinnetwork.org/book clubs. This is being recorded and will be online. Captions with machine translations are there to click on. And we are delighted to feature as our first author and to welcome to the RootsAction Education Fund Book Club, George Yancy. George Yancy is the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Philosophy at Emory University and a Montgomery Fellow at Dartmouth College. He is the author, editor, and co-editor of over 25 books. Yancy's most recent books include the third edition of the book we are here to discuss, Black Bodies, White Gazes, The Continuing Significance of Race in America. Professor Yancy is going to have some opening remarks, and then I will address some questions to him, possibly some of my own concoction, definitely some that you type into the chat. So please put your questions there in the chat at any time, and as many as you like. George Yancy, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm glad to be here, especially to be part of the inaugural book club, book review club. So thanks for having me. So I think that what I'll do in order to give a framework for what I'm doing in the book, Black Bodies, White Gazes, I want to make clear a few terms that are in the text, but I need to make them clear so that they can become form the background for supporting exactly what I'm arguing. Now, as with any field of study, philosophers have their own lexicon, their own vocabulary. So some of these terms are a little out there, but that's okay, I'll define them. So basically 4 points. For me, the way I think about whiteness, and I think about this this way in the text, whiteness is what we might call the quasi-transcendental norm. Now, I say quasi because quasi means as if it's the transcendental norm. Now, what do I mean by the transcendental norm? If anyone here with us has studied Immanuel Kant, German philosopher, he argued that there are certain concepts that are transcendental, which means that they are a priori, which is the Latin word that means prior to experience. So he thought, for an example, that space was a transcendental concept, meaning there are things in the world that we can see, like my computer screen, I see myself, my cap, my glasses, I have a cup here next to me, my desk is here. Those are empirical objects. Kant says that there's an empirical idea that we have that corresponds to those things. It picks those empirical things out. But he says space is not an empirical thing in the world. Rather, space is something that we bring to the experiences that we have. So if I were to ask you to find a book, you'd go and pick up the book. If I were to ask you to point to your glasses, you could do so. But if I asked you to point to space, it would be kind of a weird, like, oh, I don't know, out there somewhere. So space for Kant is the transcendental conditions for the possibility of having experience at all. So without this pre-linguistic structure that we have and that shapes what we perceive, we would not be able to perceive anything. So now what does that mean? Well, to say that whiteness is this way, and by the way, Kant thought that this feature of our brains, our consciousness, it was universal and necessary. To say that whiteness is the transcendental norm means that whiteness is sort of like that. It constitutes the conditions for the possibility of racial difference. So that, for an example, to be white is to be human as such. To be white is to be a person as such. But to not be white, as against the background of the quasi-transcendental norm that is whiteness, is to be deviant or different. So for an example, a good way of talking about this is that everyone probably has heard of BET. And what is BET? It's Black Entertainment Television. It names itself. But the question I might ask using this concept is, what is WET? Which means, what is white entertainment television? Well, no one speaks about that which is wet. White entertainment television is the backdrop. It is the normative framework through which we just see figures playing themselves out, playing roles on the screen as human beings. So they aren't marked in this way. They are human beings. So to be Black, to be Latina, to be not white is to be marked as race. It's to be named. It's to be marked. So whiteness goes unmarked, it goes unnamed, and it is indeed invisible as a norm. Whereas Blackness is not only visible, Blackness is also hyper-visible, depending on the circumstances. So that's what I mean by whiteness as the transcendental norm. So if you're thinking about the white gaze, then, as I'm theorizing in this text, keep in mind that whiteness as the quasi-transcendental norm is operating. 2, whiteness is a binary structure. And by what I mean by that is that whiteness needs the other as the other in terms of which to define itself. So for an example, I have an example here, Ruth Frankenberg, who's a very stellar thinker who's written about whiteness. She writes, quote, "As I and other colleagues," and she means white colleagues, "have argued elsewhere, there are times when whiteness seems to mean only a defiant shout of, 'I am not that other.'" In other words, what she's saying as a white woman, so when we define whiteness, we don't posit sort of positive attributes, or rather, we don't posit attributes. We sort of say, "I am not that." And in saying "I am not that," that's the definition of whiteness. It is the negation of otherness. And Toni Morrison, in a book called Playing in the Dark, has this wonderful example, and she calls it Africanism. And she writes, Africanism, quote, "Africanism is the vehicle by which the American self knows itself as not enslaved, but free, not repulsive, but desirable, not helpless, but licensed and powerful, not historyless, but historical, not damned, but innocent, not a blind accident of evolution, but a progressive fulfillment of destiny," end quote. So notice how she contrasts that, right? In other words, to be white, then, to be an American white self, you know yourself as not enslaved, but free. You know yourself as not repulsive, but desirable. So there's a way in which you need the other in terms of which to define yourself as not that other, and therefore, in some sense, as neutral, as constituting the norm. 3, whiteness is hegemonic. And by the word hegemonic, I just mean something like hegemony, which means the whiteness is a site of domination. And we can think here in terms of American slavery, we can think here in terms of white privilege, or we can think here white privilege as an immunity from systemic forms of racialized harm, or we can think about the history of European colonialism or expansionism. That's what we mean by whiteness as hegemonic or a site of domination. And then perhaps lastly, and maybe I'll add one more thing, in this text, in the background is also the idea that whiteness is hierarchical. And what do I mean by that? Here I just mean that whiteness is synonymous with civilization. Not only is it synonymous with the human, but it's synonymous with reason, it's synonymous with purity, it's synonymous with cleanliness, it's synonymous with knowledge, light, and virtue. It is at the apex of human civilization. It brings light, it brings truth. And here I would just suggest, if you're interested in this, if you're interested in those who theorize this notion of whiteness as hierarchical or as at the very apex of civilization, just think about the work of Immanuel Kant, who I just named, David Hume, Hegel, Thomas Jefferson, Carl von Linnaeus, Christoph Meiners, Georges Louis Leclerc, Charles White, Samuel Morton, and others. In other words, these thinkers who were, let's say, engaging in natural science, who saw themselves as doing even natural philosophy, they identified anthropology, rather they used anthropology as the lens through which to capture what it meant to be human. And if you think about the word anthropology, it comes from anthropos, which means the human. So typically anthropologists then were European. Not only did they invent the field, but they also divvied up different kinds of beings some of whom were human, some of whom were subhuman or deviant or fundamentally different. And so for me then, to think about Black bodies is to think about Black bodies in this book as the site of dereliction, the site of evil, the site of criminality itself. In other words, it is often said that white people commit crimes, but Black people are the very essence of criminality itself. So it's the Black body as dirty, the Black body as uncivilized, the Black body as uneducable, the Black body as hypersexual, the Black body as a fiend, right? So there are all these negative predicates that constitute the Black body, but only in relationship to the way in which whiteness is constituted. So if you think about the white gaze, then I'll just give you one example and then we can move on, maybe two examples, and we can move on to Q&A. Think about, for example, philosopher Cornel West. You all probably have heard of him. He's one of the most visible, prominent Black philosophers in the country. Cornel West was once driving in a car, and he was stopped by police officers for driving in a residential area too slowly. Right? In other words, he was driving too slow in a residential area, and he was stopped. Another time, police officers stopped him, and they accused him of trafficking cocaine. And he, Cornel West, said, "I'm not trafficking cocaine. I'm a professor of religion. I'm a philosopher." And I can't repeat verbatim what the police officers said, but they said, "Yeah, and I'm the flying nun. Let's go," and then use the N-word and threw him in the car. And if you're familiar with the Flying Nun, which many of you probably aren't familiar with the Flying Nun, but it was played by Sally Field, who played the role of a nun who could fly. And what the white police officer was saying is that there's no way that this Black body could be a professor of religion because there's something about being Black that's oxymoronic in relationship to being a professor of religion or professor of philosophy. So there's a way in which the white gaze, and this is the last thing I'll say here, might be said to be Procrustean. And what do I mean by Procrustean? Think about the mythological figure Procrustes. And what he used to do is he would wait in the forest and he would wait for you to come by and he would try to force you in his bed. And if you were too short to fit you in his bed, he would stretch you. Right? And if you were too long, he would basically lop off your limbs in order to fit into his bed. So to talk about the white gaze then as Procrustean is to say that the white police officers could only see, in some sense, Cornel West as someone who trafficked cocaine, but not as a philosopher. In other words, it framed his body, it truncated the meaning of his body. But the white gaze, since it has so much power, since it is a way of seeing, a cultural way of seeing, a historical way of seeing, there's a way in which Cornel West's body became encased or trapped in the purview of the white gaze. So that gives you a framework, right, within which to think about when I say something like, we need to focus on the meaning and the vitality and the toxicity of the white gaze. That gives you a framework for sort of understanding what's going on in the background, conceptual background.
Wonderful introduction. I had a pile of questions I wanted to ask, as you know, Professor Yancy, after reading the book, but now I have a different pile of questions I want to ask after hearing your opening remarks, and maybe we can get to both sets. But how much of the surface of the Earth do you think that whiteness is a quasi-transcendental concept? Is that everywhere? Is that in the United States boundaries? Where is that?
Excellent question. I would argue in the vein of someone like Charles Mills, the late Charles Mills, absolutely brilliant philosopher who wrote a book called The Racial Contract. And Mills would argue that whiteness is a global phenomenon. I would also argue that whiteness is global. Now, it doesn't mean that, and let me tell you what I mean by that. So for an example, if you think about when the Williams sisters were playing in Russia, the head of the Federation of Tennis, there was a guy there who referred to the Williams sisters as the Williams brothers. which was a way of project. Now this is in Russia. It's a way of projecting onto the black body, the black female body, as somehow absent of something like femininity, right? There's something about the female body that is masculine. And what history has told us is that the white gaze has in fact truncated the black female body in a way that cuts it away, that severs it from a claim to femininity in the way in which white women are, in some sense, feminine by their very nature. Think about the state-run newspaper when in North Korea, when President Obama, when Obama was president, in their paper they referred to Obama as a wicked black monkey. Question: they're not in the U.S., right? So how they're not even in Europe, for crying out loud. So what is it about? What is it about the white gaze that has traveled geographically, as it were, such that North Koreans internalized, or at least in that paper, it exhibited this very notion that the black body is simian, the black body is ape-like by its very nature, right? I mean, this is anecdotal. I had a student of mine who is from China, and she told her father, she went back home and told her father about what we were studying. We were studying stuff about whiteness and so on. And he said, just out of the blue, she said, just randomly yelled out, "I'll never have a black person in my restaurant." And she said, "Dad, you don't even know any black people," right? And he said, "Well, I won't have them in my restaurant," right? So, and if you go if you go to those places, if you think about what's happening in Norway, if you give there's these various accounts of the ways in which black bodies, despite where they happen to be, even in Africa, we have cases where Togo in South Africa, they use these bleaching creams, which have these horrible dermatological impacts on the skins of African people, where they're trying to be white, right? There are cases of them being interviewed that says, "Why did God make me black?" Right? So I'm arguing that not only is whiteness global in a non-black way, but even in Africa itself, there's a way in which the white gaze is mobile. It has traveled, right? And we just think about the ways in which Europeans have cut up the world. Think about in 1884, I believe 84, the Berlin Conference, where European nations just literally cut up Africa for their own desires, right? So if you think about Belgium, you think about England, you name it. These are places where anti-blackness has evolved and where there has been a conceptualization and understanding of oneself as somehow embodying enlightenment, embodying virtue in virtue of not being black. So yes, I'm going to argue global.
There's a strong case I think you make. I think U.S. influence on the rest of the globe may be part of it. I know that U.S. military bases in much of the world are often resembling mini apartheid states. But I have to assume this is perpetuated largely by that, great leftist liberal force known as Hollywood. I don't know what your analysis is.
Well, let me say also that even independently of the U.S., I mean, some scholars have argued that the term whiteness in the United States was used around, some say around 1691 in Virginia, when there was that was sort of the first anti-miscegenation law, which is basically a law against Black people and white people marrying or having children. And in that law, it was very specifically stated that it referred to a white woman. This was in 1691. A white woman will be kicked out of the Dominion of Virginia if she were to marry a Black, or it may have said African, a mulatto, or an Indian, right? So that's 1691. Also keep in mind that German philosophers, French philosophers, all of these individuals who were working as anatomists, working as anthropologists, working as archaeologists, they also were responsible for developing the very concept of race itself, right? So yes, I'm teaching a course called Race and Film this semester. And the first movie we're watching is King Kong, the original 1933. So I have to agree with you. I mean, we may differ on how we think about Hollywood as being left or right,
That was tongue in cheek there.
Yeah, right, I got you. But apart from that, definitely, I mean, I often joke with my students. I say, and this is a joke. I say I'm tired of watching white people fall in love, be intimate. I'm tired of watching white people go through the sadness and trauma of what it means to get cancer. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that I'm not empathetic. What I'm suggesting is that what Hollywood feeds us, particularly Black people and non-white people, we have to identify not only with Black people, but we have to identify largely with white characters, scripts that were written for white people, right? So much is asked of us. We have to cry not only when Black people on film get cancer, but we're required to cry when white characters get cancer, So I would argue that Hollywood is pervasively white. It's narratives, it's production, it's mise en scène, to use that word. All of it is primarily white, which isn't to say that there aren't people of color who are creating counter narratives. We know that, the Jordan Peels, etc. But notice that even in those films, we're talking about Black film. Notice it names itself, but we don't name white films. We don't say, I just saw this movie where these white characters are doing X. And so we're going to look at King Kong, which is a fascinating text, filmic text, that looks at, obviously King Kong the first, but the ways in which Kong himself embodies a certain kind of Black male brutishness in relationship to this very delicate, pure, and untouchable white woman. So it's right there. I'm agreeing with you.
Let me try and take a question or two from the chat. Here's one. A lot has changed in the world since the first edition of the book. How has social media changed the white gaze?
Okay, excellent question. How has social media changed the white gaze? I think that social media has both reinforced the white gaze and perhaps interrupted the white gaze. And what do I mean by that? By changing it, I'm suggesting that, look, we know that there was, it's not really social media, but we know when there were these video cameras, there were images of Rodney King being beaten, right, by the LAPD. But we know those police officers got off, the LAPD, right? Though we had images, right? And, Black folk were saying, finally, we've got it, right? What we've been talking about in terms of police brutality. So I think that the counter to the white gaze is where we have, for an example, the George Floyd brutal killing, right? Now, we want to be careful how we look at that, because we want to be careful that we don't look at that in a way that creates what some have called a kind of trauma porn, which is the idea of being obsessed with the Black body being in a state of pain, right? So I'm suggesting that the use strategically of social media to highlight the brutality of anti-Blackness in everyday life has been absolutely incredible, meaning we get eyes on the ground, as it were. But of course, we know social media is also a part of a larger, you might call it neo-fascistic domain, within which surveillance culture is what we constitute, right? So that becomes a dangerous way in which it's being used. But there's a way in which that social media still reinforces it. And by that, I mean something like this. It doesn't always completely disrupt the white gaze. Sure, it brings information. It gives us a counter narrative. But the white gaze, I would argue, is so rigid. It is so invested in its purity that what we get is white people feeling sorry for what they're observing. But in feeling sorry, that's a form of whiteness still. The philosopher Susan Sontag gives this wonderful response to looking at videos of war, looking at films and photography of war. And she says, when we're sitting down, all of us here. She says, but I'm applying it to the white gaze. When we're watching some images, some photographs of some war, what we generally do is feel empathy or sympathy. But in feeling sympathy, she says that creates a false proximity to the suffering. In other words, it gives us the illusion that we're close to it, when in fact we aren't at all. And that it creates a level of impotence and a level of empty empathy, where by saying that we're empathetic, we in essence trick ourselves into thinking that we are not perpetuators of the very thing that we're looking at. So if you think about the white gaze and whiteness in the way in which I've defined it, while it's true, as the one person wrote, the book is dated. It was 2008, it came out initially, then there was a 2016, now there's a 2025-26 edition. I would argue that the white gaze across that span and way beyond my birth and our birth here, the white gaze has been this powerful way of structuring the world and also protecting itself, so that even though there's social media, I'm suggesting that social media can create the illusion of proximity, so that when white people say, oh, I saw that and I really felt for that. Well, I want white people to ask the question, rather than feeling sympathy for what you've seen, ask yourself to what extent your whiteness and your white privilege are themselves implicated precisely in the conditions of anti-Blackness.
Now, see, I don't want people to just feel sympathy and sadness or guilt. I want people to feel moved to action to change things for the better. There's a question in the chat that says, in as much as what it is, and assuming we wish to move beyond the hegemony of whiteness, what does the professor imagine would need to happen in this generation or the next 7 generations to move beyond this psychodynamic social political anathema? And let me add my version of this question, as I had it earlier. In the book, you write that white people need to pay critical attention to the ways in which they can relinquish white power. What are some of those ways? How can we expand them? How do they interact with working for a more egalitarian society in general?
Beautiful. Both questions are really good. I want to give a quote by Peggy McIntosh. If all of you will be very interested in reading her. It's a very classical piece on white privilege. And Peggy McIntosh says 2 things that I want to frame before I answer the question. She says that when she was, and she's a white woman, she says that when she was young, she didn't think about racism as a structure that is conferred upon her unsought. She didn't think about whiteness as a systemic structure that conferred upon her unsought dominance from birth. And so she's arguing that when she was taught about racism, she was just taught to think that, who's a racist? Well, it's the Klan, neo-Nazis, right? It's obviously the mean white people, right? The card-carrying Klan, right? But what Peggy McIntosh is saying there is that there's a way in which to be white in this country is not to wake up one morning and choose to be white. It's not as if you say, oh, today I think I'm going to be a racist. No, although there are some white folk who are card-carrying racists. She wants to say that I've never thought about racism as a system within which I am embedded and that is conferred upon me. And she actually uses the term dominance, or even the way in which it's conferred upon me, the title of oppressor even. And then she has this other phrase where she says, I was just taught to see my moral state as a result of my moral will. And what she's saying there is she's saying that for the most part, as a white person, she was taught to think about herself as an individual, so that what she did wrong was a result of what she willed to do, rather than being part of a system that, and I'm going to use a fancy word here, that interpolates her or hails her in a way that she would want to refuse, but she can't, because she's a part of the systemic structure of whiteness, or the systemic structure of white privilege. And this is why white people even if they're not so quote unquote, card carrying racists, can go shopping in a store without being stopped, or they can be pulled over without the police officer without the police officer coming up to them and accusing them of having done something wrong. They can just be pulled over, but for no apparent racial reason, right? That is to say, any sense of being non-white. So my point here is to say that first I want to describe a situation that makes undoing whiteness hard. It's hard because how does one step outside of whiteness if whiteness is a system? So for an example, if you think about, who is it? Carl, the name's gonna skip me. It's gonna skip me, but it was two white individuals who decided to go against what were called neighborhood covenants. And neighborhood covenants are basically where white people would come together and say, look, we're not gonna allow it's called redlining as well. We're not gonna allow any Black people in our neighborhood, no inward people in our neighborhood. And this case with Anne, I almost got her name, Anne and Carl Braden, that's it. Anne Braden and Carl Braden were whites. And what they decided to do is they decided to buy the property in this all white neighborhood and then deed the property to a Black couple. Well, once the whites found out about this, right, they burned down the house. Luckily, the Black people weren't in it. But what's my point there? Anne Braden and Carl Braden were called race traitors. They were called communists, right? They were called all kinds of epithets, right, because of what they had done. But think about this as a circle within a larger circle. So while Anne Braden and Carl Braden disrupted whiteness, one of the policies of whiteness, neighborhood covenants, there's a way in which, while they did that and sort of, as it were, demonstrated their anti-racism, they have to move away from that spot and yet still exist within a white structure that then continues to see them as white and thereby confer upon them privilege, power, decency, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, Du Bois, the great W.E.B. Du Bois, referred to this as the wages of whiteness. That even though white people can be as poor as Black people, there's something that white people have, and that is whiteness. And it is a property that gives them power, and it's beneficial. So what do I think in the light of what I'm painting? James Baldwin says, it's a beautiful quote, he says, any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one an identity, and the end of safety. So my argument is that for something like a post-white world to emerge, we would have to undo not just the beliefs, not just the ideology of whiteness, not just what philosophers call the doxastic dimensions of whiteness, which would be the beliefs, the prejudices, the ideology, the racist beliefs, but the structures themselves, these social historical forces, right? Because even if you don't, let's assume we came across a person who had a white person who had no racist beliefs. I mean, I think that's impossible, but let's assume that they didn't have any. That white person would still benefit from what Peggy McIntosh is saying, this conferral of unsought dominance, in as much as they live within a white racist society. So I'm saying that what is needed, I can't even imagine what it would take to undo the history of white supremacy in this country, which for me means the history of anti-Blackness, because of the ways in which whiteness is embedded in institutions and the ways in which whiteness is embedded within the very psyche of white people. Now, that doesn't mean that I argue. It doesn't mean that I deny that white people can fight against racism. But at the end of the day, for me, the best that whites can be are anti-racist racists. So that for me then, being a male within a society of sexism, I would say, that the best that I can become is an anti-sexist, right? Because there's ways in which whiteness will still trap you. I mean, I'll give you one example that I'll move on. Tim Wise, who's an incredible white scholar who's written about white privilege. Tim Wise gives this fascinating example where he is going to get on an airplane. He gets on the airplane. And by the way, he's smart, right? He's sophisticated in his whiteness and the way in which he thinks about and critiques whiteness. He walks by the cockpit and he sees two Black pilots. And then he says to himself, oh my God, can these guys fly this plane? Which means that we have to ask ourselves, where did that come from? Where did it come from? It's my argument, and David, I think you asked the question about this, about the unconscious or the subconscious. My sense is that whiteness is also so internalized that it's become what I call a site of opacity, meaning it's hard to see. And it might take a lifetime for white people to undo the internalized whiteness, the internalized anti-Blackness that are inside of them.
And yet hard and impossible are two very, very different things. And what you're telling us is extremely depressing, if true. It's extremely depressing for society, for those of us who would like to see it rid of this horrific stupidity called racism. And it's depressing for those of us as individuals who get labeled white guys because of what you're saying about us. So I guess one question I have as someone who is significantly aware of my white privilege, my current white privilege, my generational white privilege, and someone who engages in anti-racist educational and activist efforts, you could get me drunk, you could hypnotize me, you could afflict me with Alzheimer's, and you could probably get me to say something racist. But probably after I'd said a great many other horrific things that I also would never act on, which cannot easily be found to be influences on my behavior in life in any way, shape, or form. And the racist thing wouldn't come out of some much more racist past period in my life because there wasn't any. And yet, there isn't anything that's convinced me that it isn't just idiotic to identify as a so-called white person rather than a human being, or that it's all right for a book like your book to convict me of complicity for what I look like, or to speak of, quote, white people as a centuries-long racist consciousness that inherits a history of racism because, quote, after all, it is the history that they created. Would it be wrong or would it be difficult to write that some white people affirm themselves through negating Black existence? Or do you actually believe that I do that?
Beautiful. If I don't answer that, say that again. Not the whole thing, but just the very end of that. I mean, and for those who are listening, powerful question. Well, it's a lot there, right? And it's one that if I'm to think about these things quite seriously, and I do, I hope I do, it deserves a response and a coherent response. I would argue, first of all, that I don't think it's about what you look like that's the problem, right? In other words, what you look like is, at one level, biologically, just a question of a lack of melanin, right? it's not having so much melanin. But John War, so I would say looking like a white guy is not the problem. The problem is the values and the assumptions that are historically embedded in American culture that interpret you independently of what you desire. So for an example, when you walk into a store, right, and I walk into a store, let's say we walk in at the same time, I get followed. I'm assumed to be the criminal. I'm assumed to be the one who's going to steal something, whereas you get to shop. Why do you get to shop? Well, because your whiteness, independently of what you desire, signifies for the security that you're okay, that you're one of the good ones, that you're innocent, because whiteness is, after all, deemed innocent, right? It's unsullied, it's clean. So, but notice, David, as you walk into the store and I walk into the store, it's not necessary for you to oppose your existence to Black people in some self-conscious way. I don't believe that I believe you, David, when you say that you don't consciously think about your whiteness in opposition to Blackness. I believe that there are many white people, and Cornel West has critiqued me rightly on not giving more attention to white folk who are progressive and who mean right, who mean to do right things and to go against and fight against to fight against whiteness and white privilege and white power and white hegemony. But notice what happens when you walk into that store. The relationship between us gets complicated. In other words, there's a way in which you don't touch me physically, but there's a way in which you're, and I'm going to throw a fancy word out here for those who want this, haptic. I'm throwing the word haptic out, Haptic. And haptic means to touch. My argument is that, David, when you walk into the store and I walk into the store, there's a haptic relationship. Now, you're not physically touching, but there's a way in which the social skin, the racialized social skin of that space creates a difference that maybe neither one of us want. But yet you get to shop. And what does it mean to shop? It means to walk around, to feel good, to debate what you're going to get, to be a human being, to be a citizen of the United States. Whereas when I walk into the store, and this is anecdotal, and I've heard many stories like this, or whether I'm in an elevator, which is one of the chapters in the book, I am followed. And what does that mean? It means that I am surveilled, which means that in my bodily comportment, I'm constantly looking around. I'm thinking, okay, there he goes again. I'm in the toothpaste aisle. Somehow the white security guard's in the toothpaste aisle, buying toothpaste when I'm there. So there's all this stress, physical, embodied stress and psychic stress that is applied to the Black body. So I'm arguing that whiteness, the way in which I'm thinking about whiteness, it's not so much an individual mode of decision making, although there is that. And when I'm talking about white people, I don't see myself as talking to the Klan or neo-Nazis. I see myself as talking to good, everyday, perhaps even Christian. Call them liberal, call them progressive whites. That's who I'm talking to. Why? Because often they're the ones who believe and tell stories about themselves that exempt them from the ways in which their very embodiment in this culture. Think about white privilege as one way of thinking about it as in water. That's one way of thinking about it. I mean, when a fish is in, what is a very basic, when a fish is in water, it doesn't know that it's in water. It only knows that it's in water when it's out in some sense, right? And then it's unclear whether it knows it in some epistemological way, but it begins to gasp, right? It can't breathe. But being a part of this culture and to be white is not just about an individual and what the individual intends. So that I would argue, David, good whites. So for me, the good white, bad white distinction obfuscates the importance of seeing whiteness on a continuum. So the structure of whiteness is itself a continuum. And sure, I want to say there's a difference between David and any other whites who are here, Bill, assuming that Bill is white, and the other whites who are joining us are not part of the Klan. After all, I'm not like Bill Cosby or Epstein or any other sexist, right? But that doesn't free me from the pornographic imaginary. That doesn't free me from the male gaze that objectifies women. So I want to say too, that continuum is very important. The white students that I teach aren't part of the Klan, but that doesn't free them from the critique of being part of a system over which they can't undo, and that structures their own identity in ways that they don't want. And if we're talking about systemic racism, which is really important, we have to give that kind of analysis. Otherwise, what we're saying is that racism is really about beliefs and about what we do in our own lives as individuals, when in fact, what we want is a more abstract analysis that also includes the structures. And that's why I quoted Baldwin by saying that for Baldwin, any real change implies the breakup of the world the breakup of the world as we know it, right? The loss of all that gave one an identity. So what I would like to see is the complete and I'm going to use a term here, then be careful how I say it, the complete death of whiteness. Now, anybody who quotes me on this, please get it right. I am not saying the death of white people. Right? I have white friends, I have white colleagues, I have white people who I love, right? So I'm not saying that, but the structure of whiteness, right? That which makes your body handsome, beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, that which gives your body innocence, that which makes your body non-criminal. Or even when you commit a crime, it becomes a narrative about how you grew up, and perhaps someone in your life didn't do X for you, as opposed to you being intrinsically, a criminal, right? Du Bois made a distinction. To be Black is to be a problem. To be white is to have problems, right? So that pessimism that you all are feeling, if you are feeling this pessimism, the view that I'm framing here, and if you're white, imagine the pessimism that I feel as Black if I'm saying that I am subject to whiteness as a form of anti-Blackness, right? But what I'm doing is demanding more of white people than what they've demanded of themselves.
I think regarding the death of whiteness, along the lines of Nietzsche saying that God was dead, but his ghost was going to haunt us for quite a while. Whiteness is dead. If we stop and think about it, it's nothing but denial of Blackness. It's idiocy. It's not scientific. It's not rational. But the ghost of it is going to haunt us for quite a while. One of the things I like about this book, really, really like, is that in the walking in the store story, in the elevator story, you're offended at being prejudged a criminal, because I think not just Black people, but everybody is being very heavily conditioned to not be so offended. And I think we should be. Obviously, I get the same treatment in stores that you do, just much less frequently. So it's not, an unknown experience. And you've probably gone into a store once or twice and not gotten that treatment. It's just a question of who gets it much more often than the other guy. But and so I'm very offended at, at doors locking and so forth. And we are in a society now where there are thugs in the airport with uniforms on, there's bulletproof glass in the bank, there's security cameras everywhere, so that everyone gets to be treated as a horrible criminal quite frequently. And I wonder if the racist suspicion of people has fueled this general suspicion of people. And I wonder if there's anything we can learn from disapproving of the racist suspicion of people that can help us disapprove and resist this general acceptance of everybody being suspect.
Oh, and okay, beautiful again. Two things I want to say that you mentioned. I think you're right. I really like your term about whiteness as itself being unreal. And I think it is unreal, meaning when it takes itself as the transcendental norm, that's why I called it quasi. It's as if it's a transcendental norm, when in fact it isn't. It's just a created, invented, as you put it, ghost. It's a phantasm that white folk historically have created, but it's a myth. But it's when we take it as being real, right? And that's what white people have done, is taken it as being real. And of course, we know it has real material, economic, existential implications in the world. That's one. Two, I just want to make a slight distinction. And even as you might be stopped in a store, I would only want to make the distinction that when I'm stopped in a store, I'm stopped precisely, I think, because of my Blackness. But when white people are often stopped, I don't think that a white security guard kind of goes, let's see, they're white. I think they need to be stopped, right? I think there's some other variable that we'd have to think about, but I like your point nonetheless, right? So there's a way in which the Black body is always already on the precipice of being followed, even though there are times when I have not been followed, right? But yet I feel as if somehow I will be followed. It's something about that will be followed because I have been followed that is so nagging, right? That is so upsetting, right? It's sort of women who are part of our patriarchal, sexist, misogynist society who often feel they may go a day, let's say, without being sexually objectified. But there's that idea that I could be sexually objectified today that is also so haunting, right? But your question's a good one. I'm not sure I'm not sure if, well, then again, I'm not sure. You raise a good question. Yes, maybe I'll answer it this way. If we think about anti-Blackness as itself a form of historical hatred, a form of historical marginalization, a form of historical dehumanization, is being rendered the abject, the throwawayable, the way in which the Black body gets objectified, that's through a racial anti-Black white lens. But I think that what you're suggesting is something that is very Anglo-American and European. And well, what do I mean by that? Let's just take the United States. Think about pre or post 9/11. I think that what you're suggesting is that, and particularly if we think about this present moment that I'll describe as perhaps neo-fascist, or however you want to describe it. I'm sure some of you all disagree with me on this, but we are certainly approaching something like, I think, fascism. And fascism operates by creating an us versus them dichotomy. In this case, not only is it Black folk, but it's folk who think, right? So to think critically is to be un-American at this very moment, right? So I think that if you describe this current context as neo-fascist, and being neo-fascist it's the dichotomy between us and them. It's a way in which bodies are placed under surveillance. There's a way in which bodies are under the control of different kinds of institutions, different kinds of regimes. I think that there's a specific way in which not only is America, the US, anti-Black, but I think, so that's going to be there, right? And I think that Black people will continue to experience this kind of surveillance culture disproportionately than whites, and perhaps even more than people of color more generally. But I would argue with you, I think I would agree with you, David, that there is something to be learned about the Black experience in terms of the way Black people are dehumanized, the way in which I'm made into something that's not me. There's a way in which I want to say, I defy that notion that I'm somehow a criminal, right? I defy the notion that I'm somehow an oxymoron if I'm a Black philosopher, that I have a PhD, right? Malcolm X was clear about this. He said, basically that a Black person with a PhD is and I'm not going to say it, is an N-word with a PhD, right? So I think that if we think more humanistically, if we're much more ethically robust in terms of how we think about what it means to be a human being in America, let's just take America alone, there are ways in which many of us, from those of us who are impoverished, homeless, those who don't have jobs, who experience homelessness, those who are relegated, to the outskirts, to the beyond the metropole, the margins. I think that thinking about anti-Blackness, even though it's very unique, I think can lend credence, or at least out of that, develop an ethics that's robust enough to speak to the way in which there's this broader way in which all of us are made into these things and have images and assumptions projected onto our bodies that get us wrong, which is quite debilitating for all of us. I mean, for everyone that's listening here who've had experiences where you've been gotten wrong, just think about the weight of that, what it means to carry that. So I think that what we need to do is to learn how to deconstruct our gazes so that the humanity of all of us can stand out, right? So that there's a way in which the Procrustean gaze of all of us is not so I shouldn't say so dehumanizing, but isn't dehumanizing, where the alterity, the otherness of the other can show itself to us in such a way that we are transformed by the presence of the other, as opposed to the other being transformed and degraded by us.
Wonderful discussion from you, George Yancy, and from contributors to the chat. We don't have a lot of minutes left if we're going to do this in an hour. I want to ask about here I am in Charlottesville, Virginia, where we famously had a neo-Nazi rally several years back. I want to ask about the people who are openly and proudly racist. Some of the people who have been featured in these social media videos that drove the Black Lives Matter movement, because it seems to me we're moving in the direction of having more people who are openly racist and more people who are really, really anti-racist, and or closer to being that than you think is possible. And so I wonder if you see in the future that as a realistic possibility, that we're moving toward having not so much all of these people in denial and subconsciously racist and not aware of their privilege and so forth, but actually a block of people who are passionately xenophobic, racist, bigoted, pro-violence haters, and a block of people who really, honest to God, are against such horrors and foolishness.
Yes, so I have to agree with you. So what I want to say, I think that, yes, Charlottesville, in fact, the Charlottesville example allows for a nice segue for me to make that comparison again, and then I'll come back. Think about Anderson Cooper, for example. If Anderson Cooper if he had a group of white pundits on his show, I think he still has a show, yeah, CNN, a group of pundits, and let's say they were Black, some were white, and they were all looking at what happened in Charlottesville. So here's how my argument works. My argument is that Anderson Cooper will say how horrible that is. He will say, oh my God, can you believe these, soil and blood and soil, right? Something against Jews, right? The tiki torches, right? Clearly rabid white racists, right? who want America to be great again, which in some sense means for it to be all white again, I guess, right? All white again, where you have, Jim Crow racism again, I imagine. Because they've so internalized things like, I was writing here, resentment and aggrieved loss and a sense of victimization. I mean, when you feed that stuff to white people, particularly white men, right, magically, despite the fact that Black people have been enslaved longer than we've been free in this country, for white men to think that they are the most oppressed group at the moment is just mind-boggling. But so I take that example about Charlottesville. If I were on that show with Anderson Cooper, I would say to Anderson Cooper, I hear you, and we agree about this toxic demonstration of whiteness. But I would ask you, Anderson Cooper, to think about your own white privilege, your own internalized racism. Have you given that thought? Because at the moment, you're just distinguishing yourself from what was going on in Charlottesville. But to what extent are you too part of the problem in as much as you are white, right? So I want to keep that tension in this space. But I think that I have to believe, and maybe I'll quote Baldwin again. Baldwin says, "I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive." And Du Bois says that I'm not hopeless, but I'm unhopeful. So I'm not hopeless, but I'm unhopeful that we will get that contingent of white people who will be able to do, as Baldwin says, radically transform this world. And I mean the whole world, but let's think about the US as a miniature world, to somehow radically transform the US, where to be white continues to be a site of privilege, a site of power, a site of purity, a site of the human, right? So what we need to do is disconnect, disarticulate, sever, uproot, deracinate the link between to be human and to be white. Right? We have to for whites to really understand what it means to be human, we have to do the work of separating the two, which is a deep social, ontological, and psychic struggle, right? That's the kind of work we're talking about. But I think you're right. Given the direction in which we're going, and I guess I'll go on record as saying this, we might very well end up approaching something that looks like a civil war. And here one has to be prepared to take sides. I'm saying what we see at the moment, right? And I want to hope that there are a bunch of conscious white people who understand that. Do you know how there were progressive Jews who say things like "not in our name," "not in our name," vis-a-vis Gaza, Palestinians? I would hope that there are a group of radical white folk, and I'm taking you, David, as one, who would stand up and say, "Not in my name," right? When referring to Charlottesville folk or the Boogaloo Boys or the Proud Boys or Boogaloo folk or whomever, right? But I think that's what we need in order to challenge what I see as this point at which the tension seems to be building in terms of a reconstruction and a reassertion of unabashed white supremacy, right? And white people have to say that not in my name, not I refuse that my whiteness gets interpolated or hailed or instrumentalized in the way in which it's being instrumentalized. Yeah, I mean, I still have time for another question. I'm okay. I do know we're over, but if you're fine, I'm fine if there's another question.
Well, I think that was a wonderful point to end on, and I
Okay.
couldn't agree more. I do think Anderson Cooper is paid too much to get it right. He's paid too much to get it wrong to be able to get it right. And darn near everybody in Charlottesville said, "Hell no, not in our name." But yesterday they had a city council meeting to try to criminalize homelessness. So some of it is in their name. But we do what we do what we can. I hope we are all already taking sides in a non-violent struggle and resisting any sense that it should ever be a violent one. But the book is absolutely wonderful. If you showed up here or you're watching this video and you didn't get the book and read it beforehand, you can still go and get the book. Go to teachinnetwork.org/book clubs, or just search for Black Bodies, White Gazes: The Continuing Significance of Race in America, by our guest, George Yancy. George, thank you so very much for everything you're writing and doing, and for coming on our first ever RootsAction Education Fund book club.
Oh, thank you for having me, David. And thanks for all of those who joined that I didn't get to see directly, but I appreciate it. And thanks, Bill.
Wonderful. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everybody. Good afternoon. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.